Thank you everyone for joining us today. We are super excited to have you here and to be here for this discussion. I'm Julie Langenkamp. I'm the product marketing manager at ZenOptics, and I am thrilled to kick off this next installment of our ZenTalks series. And if you've joined us for previous ZenTalks, you already know this. This is a little bit of a recap, but we at ZenOptics launched this series of mini webinars because we wanted to really promote thought leadership and share the insights of our peers and advisors and the strong voices that in the industry that we wanted to bring their insights to you. And so we began these kind of short-ish form. We tried to stick to half an hour. They're supposed to be short form discussions and kind of an informal discussion on different themes. And so today we are kicking off our next set of 3 ZenTalks, all on analytics governance maturity. And our guest speaker, our external guest speaker today is Donald Farmer. And we are pleased to welcome him. Thank you for being here, Donald. Donald is a ZenOptics advisor, but additionally, he is respected around the world for his knowledge and expertise in data management and analytics. He has a rich background working on innovative products, both with Microsoft and Click, where he led teams. He also has a consultancy called TreeHive Strategy, and he's developed a process known as the game plan. And there, using the game plan, he maps out effective step-by-step strategies for developing a culture of analytics and data literacy within organizations. In addition to that, he also focuses on governance and compliance issues, which means that all of the work that he does lends himself to be the perfect guest for this theme for analytics governance. So we are super excited to have you, not just for today, but the next 2 parts in this series as well. And then we are welcoming back Hina Sood also. She is our CTO and co-founder at ZenOptics. She is a thought leader who has worked in the trenches and alongside customers, and not only leads our product vision and strategy at ZenOptics, but also is really committed to making customers successful. So her perspective, not only from all of her experience and work on the technical side, but working alongside customers, really lends an understanding of what customers need and are experiencing. And so as we talk about analytics governance, she will look at it through that lens of what the customers experience, what they're asking for, what their needs are, and she'll lend that perspective as well. So before I let our hosts take over with the discussion, I just wanted to say, today we will be talking about analytics maturity and what a maturity model can look like. What are the goals, some of the goals of analytics governance? What are some of the drivers? And then some of the key characteristics or elements that exist regardless of what phase of maturity you're at. So we will talk about those things. On December 5th, we'll talk about, we'll look at program and process and system improvements that can advance you along the maturity journey. And then kicking off the new year on January 9th, we will look at real-world use cases and lessons learned, many from our own experience with our customers and Donald's experience with his clients and the people in his realm as well. So with that, I will kick it over to you, Donald. Thank you so much. And if you wouldn't mind just setting the stage with the perspective of, when we talk about analytics governance, what is it that we're talking about? And let's frame the conversation for today.
Sure. Thank you very much for introducing me. So I like to start with this statement on screen, that governance is not about making better decisions. It's about making decisions the right way. And I'd like to start with this partly because it's a little controversial. People push back on it all the time and say, well, all our work is about better decision making. It's about decision management, about decision support, about decision intelligence, very popular term. And here I am saying, no, it's not about the quality of your decisions. It's actually about making decisions the right way. I want to be clear that that is the role of governance. Governance is a separate practice. It's a practice which is very, very important for any business which is making extensive use of data and analytics, and that should be every business. But it is a special practice in its own right, and its focus is on the way in which we make decisions. I'll give you an example of this just from everyday life that you might understand. If you're, I live in a city of Woodinville. We have a pretty good town council. I really like the city council. I think they do some good work. They built some controversial roadworks recently. Made some changes to the city's road system. It was controversial. People didn't like it. Some people think it's a very bad decision, but it's a well-governed decision. They went through the entire planning process. They went through all the public consultation. That doesn't mean that the decision they made was right, but it does mean that the system was well-governed. In the same way, your data infrastructure, your data management, your data quality issues, doesn't mean that you make the right decision at the end of the day, but if they're well-governed, then that decision should be ethical, it should be have integrity, it should be defensible, and it enables you to keep on the right side of regulation, enables you to keep on the right side of compliance, and it also just means that you're better managed. And yes, at the end of that process, if you are better managed, you'd hope there's a better decision, but the purpose of the governance process is to manage the process, not actually to produce a better decision. So that is the slightly controversial, sometimes slightly paradoxical approach that we need to take with governance, that it's a special practice outside the immediate scope of making analysis work. If we could have the next slide. And then one of the things we want to talk about today is how does this role of governance play according to the maturity of companies? Okay, and so where are we in the in maturity? And one of the things that we often have in the world of data analysis and the world of data management, different maturity models. Where are we in terms of how advanced we are with analytics? How complete is our data management? And I like to think of maturity as being more of a spectrum that's sort of laid out in this pattern that we see on screen. So, for example, we have a business domain which starts off being speculative. We're a startup, perhaps, and we have a kind of an idea of what we want to do. We don't know it's going to work, but we're experimenting and innovating and being experimental at that point. So we're speculative. Eventually, these businesses become emerging businesses. And so they start to have a market. They're starting to get some traction in that market, starting to get increasing numbers of customers and partners and so on involved in that. And then eventually you become pretty well established and your business domain is now well established. And then there's how you behave within those domains, your patterns and practices that you apply in your business, starting with the experimental ones. Most speculative companies are quite experimental. They evolve their practices over time, and then eventually the practices become normative. And what I mean by that is they become the rule, they become the normal way of doing things. And there's a pattern that flows through this, that a speculative and experimental company is very much focused on innovation. And an emerging and evolving company is focused on optimization, and an established and normative company is focused on protection. If we dig in on the next slide, we can think about what that means for maturity a little bit more, because the strategic goals of governance are actually very different in these phases. When you start off and you're innovative, your primary concerns will be, am I compliant with legislation? That's a given. If you're in a highly regulated area, financial services, in financial services or healthcare, for example, in insurance, all sorts of things like that. You may have a highly regulated business. Doesn't matter how innovative you are, you have to work within the regulations, so you have to be compliant. The other thing is that good governance enables you to be confident in your decision making, to move forward quickly because you're well governed. By the time you get to the point of having a business which is emerging and where your practices are evolving, well, now your focus is going to be on optimization, which is to say we want to be efficient in what we're doing. And so governance is actually about ensuring we've got all our bases covered so that we can be efficient and effective in our operations. By the time you get up to being a well-established business with normative and kind of well-established processes and rules, now what is your concern, your strategic goal? You're going to find it's about, frankly, it's about protection. It's about preserving the value that you have already built into the business, including protecting your brand, protecting your reputation, and of course, protecting your exposure to legal or regulatory consequences. So you start off being kind of innovative and edgy, but you still have to be compliant. You become focused on efficiency, and then ultimately you're really concerned with issues of kind of brand and protection and reputational risk, and these different strategic goals, of course, have certain influence on the way in which you practice your governance. And so, if I could hand over to Hina, Hina's got a tremendous experience in thinking about what you practically have to do in order to govern your processes properly. So, Hina, take it away.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah, and again, before I sort of go into the practical sort of elements, right, that we've seen that really drive these processes for governance, I just wanted to call out that some of this is mutable, right? Some of these stages are mutable, and some of the I guess the maturity in or within an enterprise, depending on the organization, is also different, right? And so when we look at the critical elements that drive or support the organization to achieve these goals at whatever stage they're at, you'll see that there could be different sort of not different versions, but different, I guess, stages for each one of these, and the importance of each one of these elements, depending on the level of maturity, but they're relevant for, all of the levels as well as all of the stages. Because we're talking about, governance is a huge, broad topic, right? And I think it's also a topic that, in my experience over the last 2 weeks, I've talked to 2 customers who told me, Hina, the word governance has become sort of like very edgy, right? And I think it's controversial, like Donald said, in how you think about it. But when we look at analytics governance, right, our lens and perspective is you're sort of coming at governance from a top-down approach. A typical governance framework in what we're all used to is a very bottoms-up approach. And when I say bottoms-up, it's because it starts from the data layer. And typically everyone's focused on obviously governing the data layer and the data pipelines and the data assets, and that is super critical, right? But they're also heavy investments. And the output of data ultimately is an analytics asset. It could be a report, it could be a dashboard, it could be an Excel spreadsheet, it could be a decision model, it could be a ML model, right? So what you're consuming is that analytic asset. And if we were to shift, or maybe not necessarily shift, but sort of add on to the lens of governance, the ability to govern those analytics assets, I think in how we approach the various goals, whether you're at the innovation stage or at the protection stage, you may start to think about approaching the execution of it from a practical implementation standpoint slightly differently. And you may actually hit an ROI sooner because you're focused on sort of the starting point or the entry point of where that decision starts from, right? And you are enabling the process, but you're also enabling how someone's getting the benefit of it. We look at sort of the elements as, like I said, focused on the analytics governance aspects. When we talk about an asset here, we're talking about that analytics asset. So just for clarification's sake, that's what it means in the context of what we're going to talk about. And the quality and accuracy of the asset, that is a fundamental driver, right? Because you want to make sure that when you're looking at a particular report or an Excel file, which yes, Excel still is being used to make critical decisions everywhere. It always surprises me when my customers ask me, hey, can I just bring in all my Excels, right, into the platform and govern it from ZenOptics? And I'm like, yes, you can. Why are you using Excel? That's my next question, right? So, but the quality and accuracy of the asset is a direct, I guess, it's derived from the quality and accuracy of the data, but there is a level of governance on the asset itself to make sure that that report that was created for a certain purpose, let's say it's your, typical balance sheet, right? Well, does it have the right elements? Is it pulling from the right sources? Is it got the right fields, right? So the quality and accuracy of the asset at the asset level has its independent merit outside of the data layer, right? So that's what we see as a very critical element to the overall analytics governance framework. Now, when you think of, well, do I have 5 balance sheets floating around? That's a problem, and I would like to tackle that. So, the sprawl that has happened as a result of sort of the whole self-service boom, which is a great thing that happened, now you've got to put the guardrails around it, right? You've got to give the people the ability to manage that. And so looking at the volume of these assets and the rationalization of the assets is a very, very critical element of the analytics governance framework, because you definitely do not want 5 balance sheets moving around, or you don't want all these reports for different, for the same purpose, but sort of different variations of them, duplicates that exist, and everyone's using, their own version of it, right? That's not going to help in trying to get to analytics governance and extend that maturity, right? So our goal is, how do you make sure that you look at the volume and rationalize that, right? And then the appropriate use and life cycle is sort of correlated to it, because once you've looked at it and rationalized it, it's not a one-time exercise, it's a continuous process, right? So you've got to continuously monitor that. And to do that, you've got to establish ownership, right? And what we typically hear in our in our customer environments is people don't know who owns that asset. People don't know who's the business owner, who's the, the report owner. Yes, you may know who created it, right? Because, the systems tell you that. But who really drove that definition, right? Who really said that this is the balance sheet you need to really use, not the 5 other or not the 4 other that are out there. So to be able to sort of drive that appropriate usage and life cycle, you've got to establish ownership. And once you've done that, and you've done all of these sort of great things, and it's not hierarchical in any way, right? You could start with volume and rationalization and say, let me just clean up my environment, right? But once you've done this, the power of discoverability is what you provide to the users, right? To the end users, because now you're letting them come in and find that right asset. So you've done everything you can to make sure that you've enabled the decision-making process through a governed environment. So to Donald's point earlier, you've taken the necessary steps to make sure that whatever decision you make at the end of the day, it's not about whether the decision's right, it's about, was it made through a governed process, right? And so ultimately, if the asset was, accurate, you looked at the right asset, you know who the owner is, and you have confidence that, yes, this is the person that's responsible for this and has accountability in the organization for this, you found it, you make your decision, you're in good hands, right? So I think that confidence in how you get to that decision-making process is what we look at in the context of analytics governance.
And
Donald, do you want to add? Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm going to stop talking and see if Donald wants to add something to what I just said.
Yeah, I'm sorry to butt in, but I do want to butt in as well. I think this ownership part is actually kind of important, because one of the things which causes governance to break down in a lot of organizations is silos. Silos of technology and silos of team organization, and that habit that people tend to have of data hoarding. This is my data. This is my department's data. I'm actually not going to share it. But that actually very often just results in people sharing it without good governance, or sharing it under the radar in some way. So ownership's a very interesting thing to me. That ownership can be, it's absolutely necessary for good governance, but ownership which is too rigidly defined actually can start to be a sort of problem. And one of the things we always have to remember in governance is that we're trying to make things better. We're not trying to make things worse. I sometimes think that people see governance as a negative thing. They see it as a restraint. They see it as a way of stopping you from doing something. When actually governance is more like a way of enabling you to do something. It's a way of enabling you to be more free because you're well governed. The example I always give of this, and I think it's kind of funny one, but it's appropriate one, is I look at my my granddaughters. I've got two little granddaughters, who are 3 and 4, and of course, I always want an excuse to talk about them, but it is relevant. And they run around like crazy as little kids do, and they're just they just go wild. And you want them to do that. You want them to have that fun, but you also want to make sure they're safe. So what we do, of course, is when we're with them, we make sure that all the sharp edges are covered up, and we make sure that anything dangerous is out of the way, and then they can do what they want, because we have governed the environment they're in, and therefore they can run wild, and we don't have to be constantly correcting them. And I think this is true in the data and analytics world as well. Govern the environment, and then what you're actually doing is giving people the opportunity to be free to do the things they want to do. So I actually see good governance as an enabling quality rather than a restricting quality. And an important part of that is finding this balance in all of these elements that you've been talking about between, and I think you put it very well, that there's very different kind of very different levels of maturity and ways in which this can be considered, that we have to be flexible in that, as well as being purposeful.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Like I said, right, it's the guardrails, right? You're the
guardrails, exactly.
Yeah, and you're making sure that those sharp edges is what you're protecting the kids from, right? And we do this, we do this inherently when we're parents, and we take care of this. So when we have to look at our data or look at our analytics assets, right, it's about putting those guardrails in place, right, so that we make sure that we're not falling or hurting ourselves.
Just had this mental
it's really true.
I had this mental image of bumper bowling, and where when you're bowling, you may get a gutter ball. The bowling ball might roll into the gutter, but if you have the bumpers up, you just bounce off, and then you're back on course, and you might bounce off the other bumper, but eventually you will reach the pins at the end of the lane. So I had that image. But Donald, I love the story about your granddaughters, and that's exactly right. You want them to experience the world and experience the freedom involved, but you also want them to be within safe parameters while they do so. So speaking of enabling, this is the point where Hina and I discussed a lot of the enabling factors within ZenOptics as a platform that provide those guardrails and provide and support the key elements that she just discussed. So Hina, I will hand it back to you.
Thank you. And I love the first statement there, right? And it's ZenOptics facilitates the implementation, right, of those governance processes, and then empowers the practice of decision making, right? So going back to sort of what we said earlier, it's not about always just making the right decision. It's about how you got to make the decision, right? So we are really focused on providing that foundation that facilitates the implementation of the governance processes. It's always a combination of people, process, and technology. Technology cannot, just in a silo solve a problem or just become an enabler if the people and the process don't come along with it. And there is change management. There is an ability to, I was just at a customer site last week on training, and, it was the CIO who very openly realized that we can't just put product out there. We have to address the change management around it. And something like governance, which, like Donald alluded to earlier, does have the negative connotation sometimes. You've got to show the value as to what you're going to get from it, right? It is an enabler. So, however you start, and now that we're talking about analytics governance, which is this relatively new concept, you want to make sure that you are explaining that value, right? So those key elements that we just went over are the drivers to help explaining the value. How we actually, enable this is through sort of a combination of different capabilities. And some of these, sometimes you would be looking at all of this together, and sometimes you may say, I will start at one place and then expand my analytics governance implementation, right? So you could start sort of at the bottom or at the top. I've had various models where customers have implemented it differently. And I'll just explain each one of these, and then, Julie, we can see where we are with time. But The KPI repository is sort of the, in some cases, once you've established the catalog, the analytics catalog, you're building on top of it to build that KPI catalog, right, or the KPI repository, because you want to govern your critical KPIs that are being used in the analytics assets to make decisions, right, and or to help facilitate those decisions. So if you're looking at, your balance sheet, you're probably looking at a couple of KPIs there. How do you make sure that that balance sheet is the right balance sheet that you're using? Well, if it's got all your governed KPIs, all your certified KPIs, then you've already increased that level of confidence saying that, okay, this is the right, balance sheet for me to use. Now, if I take that down one more level to report governance, you could, so the governance at the KPI level is critical, right? Because you're making sure that that accuracy of the asset and the quality of the asset has been validated. But if I go down to the report governance, what I'm also saying is, well, yes, I know that the quality and the accuracy of the KPI within this report is certified, but has this report really been certified, right? So have I gone through a level of stewardship to make sure that there is ownership, right? And to Donald's point about ownership, it doesn't help if it's very rigid, right? Because sometimes, and it doesn't have to be a person, we've started to hear about how this is something that's being talked about a lot, is ownership at the teams level, meaning, hey, can I assign ownership to my COE? Can I assign ownership to, it was XYZ, a person, but we've started to also hear a lot about, well, can I give ownership to teams, right? So these are process teams and these are COE teams that, let's say, are responsible for certain metrics and or certain reporting. So, the report governance aspect sort of covers it at a level which is higher than the granular level of the KPIs. It's more at the report level to say that, yes, this asset is really the right asset. And it could go through, technical stewardship. It can go through, a analytics steward. It can go through a business steward, right? And or it could be a combination or just any one of these, right? There's no, that is something that the organization defines. And that's why I mentioned the whole process and change management aspect, because this is a new concept. So you've got to define, okay, how am I going to define what report governance means for my organization, right?
And
now,
if I may, I just wanted to say, in terms of that process and that change management, it's not just about the definition within the organization, it's also about the ability to communicate to the end users who are actually using and interacting with those reports and interacting with those assets. So they have the confidence, they know this is what I'm supposed to be using. This is, this is how I'm supposed to be using this KPI. They all have that standardization and they can easily see, all right, I am on the right path here as I'm trying to make this decision. So it's setting the processes, yes, but it's also about making sure that the constituents within the organization, your end user customers, have that knowledge and understand that that has been governed for them to use.
Absolutely, absolutely. The definitions, right, in terms of whether it's a KPI or an analytics asset or a report, the definition of that is what we're trying to sort of provide governance around, right? So that there is no, it's a single source of truth and it's a governed source of truth. So, going into the next two, because I'm just conscious of time as well. The usage data and the statistics and the rationalization and optimization sort of go hand in hand. And like I said earlier, it's a continuous process, right? So the usage data and statistics allow you to understand the consumption patterns, allow you to make sure that, if there are really 5 versions of something, which one's really being used? And if it's different than the one that you really are thinking of certifying or needs to be the source of truth, then you know that there is a problem in that decision-making process, right? And inevitably, or most likely, those decisions being made out of the assets that are being used that are not really the ones that you want to govern or that you want to certify, they may be the right decisions, we don't know that, right? But they've not been made the right way. They've not really gotten to that point correctly because no one's really certified it. So the usage information is critical to making sure that as you're deciding on what to govern, you have input and feedback into that process, right? Especially with the sprawl that exists. If you really don't have that visibility to what your entire ecosystem looks like, then you're probably going to put guardrails around the wrong thing, right? Or maybe put guardrails around a very limited scope. And so if you had the full visibility in your analytics catalog, you actually are more enabled to to really put the guardrails around the right scope. And so that goes into the rationalization and optimization, which is, again, all about making sure that as you're looking at the usage data, you're able to rationalize and you're able to optimize that for continuous life cycle. So I'm going to stop there in the interest of time, and I'm going to ask Donald if there's anything he would like to chime in on this.
Oh, wow, I've learned
very closely on some of these. So
yeah, I learned so much from every one of these conversations. It's fascinating. I mean, I think that the great point to make, I think, at the end here is this important point about analytics governance. A lot of the time we talk about data governance and data management, but if you're not actually governing the use of that data in terms of analytics, which then drives decision making, you're only governing half the process. And I think you've made a great case for that. Governing analytics is actually, as critical to any business as governing the data itself.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah, thank you. I thank you both. We will talk more about that. I was going to say we talk about it at ZenOptics about governing the whole analytics pipeline. What that looks like from the data elements all the way through to the end. We'll talk about that more in part 2 in this series, which is coming up again at the beginning of December. And then Hina alluded to some of the customer examples and some of the customer insights that she provided some of them here, but we'll drill into some more depth and some of the lessons learned from those customers and from experiences through Donald's consultancy and such at the beginning of January. So please, you can register them for each of these from our website, or I'll be sending out emails that you can register through as well. But I want to thank everyone for joining us today. And Donald and Hina, this has been a delightful session. I loved it. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing your thought leadership today. We appreciate it.
Thank you
very
Julie.
much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.